Hello, everyone. My name is Rio. I am the lead director of the Humanities Department here at Hamilton Education. Today, I will be going through the SAT 308, which you may have taken in tutoring or over the summer here at Hamilton or in a target class. There will be a review video here for every single question of the reading and writing. I will go through the trickiest distractors for every question, what makes the correct answer correct, how to understand the passage we saw, all of that. So without any further ado, we'll get into these questions, starting with question 1 on the first module, and we'll be doing both modules, all of this test, reading and writing, 308 from Hamilton Education. All right, so to begin here, we'll go with question 1, which is a word and context question. Ultimately, we are looking for an answer choice which shows that these skills are natural talent, right? So there's a balance between natural talent and relentless training. So some skills seem like they're completely natural, right? Serena Williams, raw power, Muhammad Ali's reflexes, Steph Curry's like insane shooting ability. But these things must refine their gifts through practice. We'll see here, innate, right? Always look for synonyms in the text. Guess what? It's in the text. Okay, so indigenous might seem like it has the right meaning, but indigenous means native to a land. Doesn't mean like a native skill, right? Ingenious, these sort of things. We're trying to say they're innate or natural. And then novel means they're completely unique or new, right? Question 1 is interesting because I'm sort of testing. If you're missing this question, I know you're not reading the whole text, right? If you're not answering number 1 correctly, you're not reading the whole text because big, okay? So this is not a trick question. This is a way for me to just make sure you are doing what you need to be doing, which is reading the whole text on these word and context questions. So if you missed this one, I will remind you, read the whole thing because usually there's a synonym, and innate is exactly the same as innate. So look for a synonym and that will direct you to your correct answer. All right, question 2 is a word and context question. It is very typical of the SAT in terms of its distractors. We have 2 words which have this sort of negative prefix, right? Detriment and deterrent. Okay. When something is to someone's detriment, though, detriment is the opposite of benefit. Okay. So if something is detrimental, might be the way you have heard the word detriment in your past, it means it is like negatively impacting your results or what you can do. Deterrent means it keeps things away. Okay, so deterrent keeps things away. To deter something is to make it cease to happen, to decrease the likelihood of something happening. All right, a substitute. So that's why deterrent is better than detriment. Incentive is an opposite distractor here because we don't want to be incentivizing predators. An incentive against is kind of strange, okay? Deterrent works better. Even if you squint, an incentive kind of works. Deterrent works perfectly. And then finally, to substitute, we're not looking for a substitute against predators. We're not looking to replace them or anything. We're looking to cease them from being able to do their thing, which is deter. So question 3 is a word and context question. That means it's basically about vocabulary, but we also need to make sure we understand the text as a whole. I think that this one can be difficult if we don't understand what the text is saying directly. Okay, so we see they could have easily succumbed to despair. All right, could have easily come to despair. Succumb to despair means that they didn't succumb to despair, right? Discordant sounds like it could be good if it was despairing, but we don't want despairing. Why do we know we don't want despairing? Because we see the rest of the text tells us what they do, right? They had a disciplined retreat through treacherous terrain, managed to get all the way back to the Black Sea, where they're picked up and brought back to Athens, I think, or Sparta. I forget where Xenophon is from. Okay, so under Xenophon's leadership, they remained something, able to organize a disciplined retreat despite hunger, ambushes, and relentless pursuit. Okay, the Anabasis is crazy, all right, and it's very influential to this day. Reckless doesn't work because we see discipline, right? Reckless and discipline typically don't go well together, all right? Nothing suggests that they're doing things out of, like what we should be doing. Finally, we're between obstinate and resolute. Okay, what does obstinate mean, right? Obstinate means stubborn, okay, unwilling to consider, a different perspective or what have you. So even if, they were stubborn by not like surrendering or apart or something like that, resolute works better here than obstinate, because resolute means basically strong and willing and all of that. Okay, so like to be resolute is to be firm in the face of adversity, which is exactly what we have here. Right, so this is a perfect example of a word and context question in which you really need to know what the text is saying in order to understand what the answer choices, which of the answer choices works best. And you need to know a good bit of vocabulary in order to get rid of the words that don't work. Right, discordant we know is like disharmony. Okay, how can we figure that out? Well, dis meaning negative, chord, sound, things going together, right? So either way, if you know your vocab, you can probably get rid of 3 of these answer choices and arrive at the correct answer of resolute. But even if you do know your vocab, if you read this passage wrong, you can end at the wrong answer choice. So that's how we arrive to C. So question 4 is a word and context question here, which we commonly call vocab questions, even though vocab isn't the only skill being tested here. Ultimately, you have to know what this passage is saying as a whole in order to get the correct word and context. Very commonly, the SAT loves to provide answer choices which fit the general kind of quote unquote vibe of a passage. I would point out in particular the distractor answer choice B, ingenuity. Okay, we're talking about AI assisting in generating or producing scientific research. All right. Scientific research and AI are both seen as very like innovative, and ingenuity is associated with being innovative, right? However, in the context of this specific passage, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about being safe, cautious, thoughtful, clear in the use of AI. All right. We're talking about integrity, okay? Accuracy, adherence to standards, and maintaining credibility. Okay, ingenuity, while involved in science, doesn't really fit any of this stuff. Okay, now another answer choice that's incorrect is providence. Okay, providence, a lot of times people don't really know exactly what it means. It's talking about the will, typically, of like a divine being. Okay, so like it's kind of like usually has something to do with like God's divine you'll see this in like colonial like pilgrims saying like only by God's providence was I able to establish Plymouth or something like that, right? Spontaneity definitely doesn't make sense here, right? Because we're talking about being careful, adhering to standards, being accurate, having integrity. Spontaneity is kind of being like spontaneous, right? Doing something on a whim. So prudence is the only answer choice that works here. What does prudence mean? So prudence is basically like being careful, thoughtful, basically like being wise, safe, all of the things having integrity associated with this passage. So you can't just be choosing an answer choice which sounds good. You have to make sure that the answer choice aligns with the passage as a whole. All right, so question 5 is one of those questions on a word. It's a word and context question. It's one of those word and context questions which really is truly you're going to succeed here if you know the vocab, and you're not going to succeed if you don't know the vocab. It seems like the logic of this passage is pretty clear. We are trying to say, ultimately, we need to have natural methods of stopping coastal erosion, right? In places like California, you have significant coastal erosion. Some possible solutions include seawalls or breakwaters. However, a natural solution to stop the erosion is going to be the best one. Okay, so I think that that is pretty clear in terms of logic. What we need to understand, though, is like which of these words means stop. Okay, and if you don't know your vocab here, you're not going to be able to find which one means stop. All right, so secession. Secession means to break away. Okay, maybe there's a form of secession when things are eroding, but we are not trying to break things away here. We are trying to stop or contain erosion. Okay, deferment means we're putting something off for later. Okay, you can pay for things on deferral, for example, meaning I'm going to pay, if this mug here cost $10, I can pay $1 a month, or I can pay $10 later. You see this commonly with the Dodgers baseball team. They pay, there's deferment on their contracts, meaning they're going to pay contracts later. Now, depletion is an opposite distractor, okay? There's definitely depletion taking place in terms of the cliffs eroding, but we don't want to have depletion of these cliffs, right? We don't want to see erosion. We want to stop the erosion. So what's our correct answer? Well, A, it's perfect. It means to stop, right? What does abatement mean? It means to stop or reduce or lessen something. Okay, so abatement means kind of like controlling, mitigating methods. Just like the word mitigate is something we see often in legal contexts. Abatement is something we see common in legal contexts, but they don't only appear there. It means to basically help control something, right? Help bring something to stop or reduce the negative impacts of something. So that's how we get A for question 5. If you're missing this one, this is one of those where these are all vocab words. So study your vocab. All right, question 6 is a word and context question that does something that the SAT loves to do, which is they use an answer choice, or a vocab word, excuse me, as the correct answer choice, which we know maybe the most common definition of that word, but we don't know the secondary or tertiary definition of that word. So our correct answer is agency. When you hear agency, maybe you're thinking about like, something in the government, like the NSA is an agency, the CIA is an agency, right? You might be thinking about like modeling, right? There's modeling agencies or booking agencies. You're thinking maybe like a company or an organization, something along those lines, all right? But agency has more than one definition. A very, very commonly used definition of agency, the one that's in our vocab list, means to basically have free will, right? To have freedom. Okay. So like to have agency is like to have control over your life, have control over your kind of like what you can do, what is possible, etc. Okay, so basically they're saying they defended human agency. They defended that there's autonomy to accept or reject divine grace, right? Agency and autonomy are very synonymous. But if you're seeing agency immediately as just its first level definition and presume it's wrong, that means you need to study more vocab. All right. A is a compelling distractor because providence has something to do with like religion. We talked about this on an earlier question on this test. It has something to do with God. But providence comes from like a divine being or God. Doctrine is commonly associated with religion, but doctrine doesn't mean the autonomy to reject or accept divine grace. Doctrine is basically the beliefs of a religious organization. Okay. So that's another classic SAT distractor, is to give you an answer choice, which is associated with the kind of ideas of the passage, right? Like we saw ingenuity showing up on a passage about science and AI. Oh, that's typically thought of as being having ingenuity. Doctrine is often associated with religion, but doesn't work in this particular context. Okay, so make sure you really understand the meaning of the word that's supposed to show up, right? We're looking for a word that says something along the lines of free will. Finally, we have servitude, which is an opposite distractor, right? Entirely determined. Salvation kind of sounds like, you're basically like a indebted or a servant to your fate. But the it's an opposite distractor here because that is what Martin Luther or John Calvin believe. But, Erasmus is somebody who believes that there is free will, so agency. Okay. If you're missing this question, you need to know secondary definitions of words. This is something we see on the SAT very, very commonly. All right, question 7 here is probably one of the 2 or 3 hardest questions on this SAT. We have a poem. We're asked to understand the structure of the text. Okay, so a couple of things, right? We have an extended metaphor, which is a terminology we've seen provided by the College Board for an SAT. What is an extended metaphor? Well, it's a metaphor that lasts for an extended period of time, right? It's not like saying, this cup is a cheetah and that's it, right? It's saying a long extended analogy, right? An extended metaphor and an analogy are very similar, right? So we have, what is the extended metaphor? We have a mother, a fond mother leading her child to bed, and nature dealing with us and taking away our playthings so that we can go to sleep, unaware of how far the unknown transcends what we know. All right. So we're being led to our rest and to our sleep by nature, we being humans, the same way a mother brings her child to bed when he's a little kid. All right. So what does this establish? How do we know this? Okay, so as a fond mother, when the day is over, leads by hand her little child to bed. Okay, so she's leading her child to bed, right? We see this here. We see the same thing here, right? Nature takes us away, leads us to our rest so gently, right? Now, the kid doesn't totally want to go to bed, but also isn't totally against it, right? Half willing, half reluctant. He leaves his broken playthings on the floor, right? And is led to go to bed. All right. We, on the other hand, have nature, which takes away our playthings one by one, broken playthings. Okay. This presumably being like our faculties, perhaps our memory. I can see perhaps this suggesting, this is a little bit beyond the scope of the SAT, but it's not so bad to die if you can't see or you can't walk when you used to, or you can't, you no longer, life is painful, right? Like you've gone from the vitality of youth to a future in which, I don't totally want to be here, but I also don't totally want to rest, right? Nature leads us to our rest very comfortingly, right? So the same way a mother would to a child, right? So how do we know our rest or our sleep signifies death? Well, that's pretty common. Okay. So The bigger thing here is getting rid of answer choices that don't make sense, right? Where is reason brought in an ordered existence through reason? And where is a full of vice shown in this? Okay. So the extended metaphor is true, but there's no full of vice. I don't see a more ordered existence through reason, right? We don't see that necessarily. Now we have characters of a caring mother and a young child to later symbolize. Where is this symbolizing here? I don't know, right? Learning as much of the unknown as we possibly can, nor is it telling us let's learn as much as possible. And then D, avoid wasting time on unimportant activities. Where do we talk about that? Where does this passage say whatsoever? Like, don't just play with things on the floor, do something more important instead. No, right? It just says in the same way that a mother gently leads a child to bed, so does nature lead us gently by removing our playthings or our tethers to life. So that's how we get to see. It's a tricky one, right? But none of this is like literary analysis beyond the scope of what the SAT asks. We don't need any crazy literary terms, metaphors, or things that have been mentioned on SAT before. So that's how you write to C for question 7. The question 8 is a main idea question. We're looking to understand the main idea of this passage, okay? So with main idea questions, we're very often looking for either a through line through the whole thing, or we are looking for some sort of thesis statement, right? So what's our thesis statement basically? Restoring grasslands led to a decline in both the human-wildlife conflicts and violence between local communities. So humans stopped fighting other humans, and humans and wildlife stopped fighting each other. So we need both of these here. So restoring grasslands. So this is our thesis. Sometimes our thesis comes at the beginning of a passage. Sometimes our thesis comes in the end. Sometimes it comes in the middle. Here it is in the beginning, right? Our answer choice is going to look really similar to this thesis, which says restoring grasslands, reduced violence between people, and decreased human wildlife conflicts. How do we know this? Well, it says it directly in that thesis statement, right? B is wrong because of this little impact on local communities. We know that's not true because we see it having little impact on local communities in the passage, or having significant impact on local communities in the passage. C, this could be perhaps true. We don't really know. But what we do know is that environmental degradation definitely did have an impact because restoring grasslands really helped things. Finally, with D, it says it failed to reduce tensions. We see the opposite because tensions were improved. So that's how we arrive to A here for question 8. Remember, when you're asked a main idea question, always look for a thesis. So question 9 is a main idea question. With main idea questions, we oftentimes are looking for a thesis statement that sort of clarifies what's going on. And we have a one right at the beginning, right? The extinction of large dinosaurs led to significant changes in forest ecosystems. All right, so that's our thesis. That's really clarifying what we're saying, right? So the extinction of sauropods, large dinosaurs, led to forest ecosystem changes. So how? Well, they used to maintain open forests with abundant light, but then they disappeared, which reduced light penetration. That meant larger seeds and fruits could be better established in the shaded environments. So plants with fruits are what came about after this change 66 million years ago. So we then see, right, larger fruits became a vital source for many animal species, including early primates, which first emerged many millions of years after sauropods went extinct. So even though primates and dinosaurs were separated by many millions of years, the increase in fruit size and seed size within the forest ecosystem was beneficial to primates. So all of that lines in. Let's see, notice that some good things like may have shaped the diets of early primates. Perfect, right? We don't want to say it did for sure. It may have. That's a good safe inference. And we see this is our thesis. An explanation of the thesis. We have denser forests. This is what we call a line of reasoning. Favor of larger fruits, etc. Okay, a couple of things that are clear in other answer choices that give it away, right? Permanent decline, forcing to adapt. Okay. These are pretty significant differences, right? A permanent decline in plant diversity, forcing an adaptation. Those are both very extreme, right? Which is a distractor type we see commonly and we want to be aware of. Seed dispersal patterns is not quite what we're looking for. So we don't really know exactly what that means. And then because seed dispersal is not mentioned whatsoever. Then finally, D, the disappearance led to restructuring. And then, yeah, that's true, but we're looking for something more specific than that. There's nothing really like directly super wrong about D, but C is certainly better, right? And then finally, like whether this is a debate, doesn't seem like this passage suggests there's a big debate. Okay, just talking about the long influence of the extinction of dinosaurs. So that's how we arrive to C for this main idea question. Okay, so question 10 of module 1 here is a really classic SAT main idea question in that ultimately we are just pulling out the thesis to find a main idea here. So on earlier main idea questions for this test, our thesis was right at the beginning of the passage. However, the thesis here is not in the beginning of the passage, right? This is context, okay? But where's our thesis? Small delta towns express concerns that the construction will bring years of problems that might make their communities uninhabitable. All right, that is our thesis. Why? Because all of this is talking about how the tunnel project could result in problems for local towns, right? We see, again, local spring irreversible impacts, right? Local apprehension, intake facilities, etc. All right, so that's how we arrive to understanding that B is our correct answer because that's the thesis, right? It's the main claim of this passage. It's what the passage hinges on. That this is first, it doesn't mean it takes primacy. Are we learning anything else about the Delta Tunnel Project? Are we learning about how it secures water supplies? Not really. Are we learning about how it will impact fisheries in these areas in terms of how it will kill the salmon? Not necessarily, right? Or the Delta smelt? Not necessarily. Is it talking about fire reduction risk or anything like that? Are we talking about climate change directly, right? Like a little bit, okay? But the main focus is on delta towns. So A is true, but irrelevant to the main idea. That's a common distractor type we see in these main ideas, right? C, again, is true, but what's the main focus of this? The impact of the Delta River Tunnel Project on local communities. And then D, we have some wrong parts. So that's how we arrive to B for question 10. Really look for a thesis. All right, so question 11 is a command of evidence question. We're looking for a quote to epitomize the suggestion offered by the study referenced in the text, right? So what is the suggestion that's offered by the study? So this passage is a little bit tricky because we spend almost half of the passage saying scientists are not seen as funny. But what is the suggestion? We see the word here. Humor enhances the likability and reliability of the information conveyed, right? So humor is successful. So we want to say, we want a quote that says humor helps, right? Now, everything up here is perhaps true, but is that the suggestion offered by the study? No, right? So what does the suggestion offer? we can become more reliable by using humor. Okay, so true. B, is this true? Perhaps, right? But that isn't true of their suggestion. Okay. C might agree with a stereotype up here, but is that what the suggestion of the study says? No. Right. Um, now A is an interesting one because, speak on a more human level. That seems kind of interesting, right? But this is what's wrong here. Reduce their perceived authority. Where would that be possible? Okay, so that's unclear. D epitomizes the suggestion most directly and succinctly and correctly. So that's how we arrive at D. All right, so question 12 is asking us to draw a link between claims made in a passage and figures we see below. Okay, so what do the people in our passage say? Well, we identified this. I identified this ahead of time with our pink highlighter. What are they focusing on? So yes, there's more communication between grown children and their own parents than in the past. What might be a cause of this? Emerging adulthood, right? It has become harder to be an adult. Okay, so this harder to be an adult explains why there is more communication between parents and their adult age children. Right. So what is made it harder to be an adult? That will align with here. Is it a romantic thing, right? Or a relationship thing? Is it a friendship thing? Is it about mental health? What is it about? Is it that we're sicker nowadays? Well, what do the article people say? They talk about wages, right? Student loan debt, low ownership, the cost of colleges, homes, healthcare, and childcare. Okay. Everything that they reference is ultimately based in economics, right? So what are our highest things? Financial, which is an economics thing, and career, which is an economics thing. All right. So what does our answer choice need to do? Our answer choice needs to say, look, financial and career and job are the highest because everything that makes emerging adulthood, what makes it hard to become an adult, is ultimately tied to economic things. So that's why our answer choice of C is so good, right? It says, right, economic challenges contribute to the fact that they're continuing to be in communication with parents, right? Because the highest things are career or job advice or financial advice, right? So A, does A connect to their claim? Is this something that's referenced in the passage? No. A is like plausible and A has true parts, right? But it isn't connected to the passage necessarily. B, if this were true, this would be really interesting, right? But where is this claim made in the passage? Nowhere. Right. Now, finally, D, parenting is more higher than mental health. That is very true. Suggesting that they are role models and emotional support, that could be true, but does this connect to the passage? No. Right. So remember, with these command of evidence quantitative questions, if they're asking you to connect to the passage, your answer choice has to be beyond just the graph. It has to also incorporate the passage, and that's how we arrive at C for question 12. All right, 13 is a lovely question in my opinion because it is difficult, but it is very logically rigorous, okay? It is not the most intuitive or straightforward command of evidence question that the SAT would show you, but it certainly really requires you command the evidence, as they say. So, what is the researcher's hypothesis? All right. The researcher's hypothesis is that Neanderthals experienced a significant reduction in genetic diversity around 11,000 years ago, right? So we know that there was a population bottleneck according to this hypothesis, right? How do we know there was a bottleneck? Well, by analyzing the shape of inner ear bones, right? There was a sudden decline in variation at the epoch, right? So what must be true? Well, it must be true that inner ear bones is directly correlated with overall genetic diversity in Neanderthal populations, right? So basically, to say there's a lot less inner ear bone diversity, meaning there's a lot less Neanderthal diversity, has to be true, right? I mean, there are certain things which, maybe reduce that don't signify a decrease in diversity, right? It's like brown hair. You can have a very, very diverse population with people with brown to black hair, right? People from all different parts of the world, all different types of genetic makeups, of all different kind of like geographical or ethnic backgrounds, and they all have brown to black hair. Okay, so inner ear bones being similar must mean that it must be directly correlated with genetic diversity. All right, so their hypothesis is that. Does B need to be true for their hypothesis? No, right? This could be of anything, right? It could be from severe selective pressures, or it could be just from, non-severe selective pressures. It just needs to show that genetic diversity is lower, right? Things that are highly conserved, this is like a random baggage distractor, okay? So you might just really know biology and know that when things are conserved, right, it means like they stay despite changes in population, right, across different either species or subspecies or anything like that. So extrapolating this to other primate species, though, is unnecessary. Even if D were true, is that necessary? No. And then finally, A. This is one of those kind of correlation does not equal causation things. Even if A were true, does that necessarily mean that inner ear homogeneity within Neanderthals means genetic homogeneity within Neanderthals? Not necessarily, right? Again, reduction maybe among, tigers, all tigers having the same, fur color would mean that they are genetically similar and going to have rapid extinction, but might not be true for humans, okay? So can't correlate across those other prehistoric species. C must be true. So good question here for this command of evidence. All right, question 14 is a logical inference question. So we are basically being asked, how can we complete the passage as a whole? So what is the logical claim from this passage? All right. Basically is claiming that cultural values have an impact on rates of divorce, right? So cultural values that emphasize individual autonomy have higher divorce rates. Those that prioritize social stability and tradition have lower divorce rates, right? So that is social, cultural, but there also are individual values, right? So even within either cultural, this next sentence, right, individuals who value these things are more likely to divorce, where those who prioritize these things are less likely to do so. Now, basically, our next thing says personal values are more impactful when cultures emphasize autonomy. So these type of people, those who value these things, those who are more likely to divorce, are even more likely to divorce if they are in a cultural that values individual autonomy. But they'd be less likely, therefore, to divorce than if they were in one that prioritizes social stability and tradition. So cultural values can moderate the effect of personal values on the likelihood of divorce, right? So this is basically saying, right, if you are somebody who really prioritizes tradition and social conformity, but you live in a society that really emphasizes individual autonomy, you might be more likely to divorce than someone who has the same personal values as you, that lives in a society that prioritizes tradition and social stability, right? So I think this is a pretty straightforward one, right? Uniform impact across cultural contexts, pretty too extreme distractor, right? Uniform meaning exactly the same. Immune, again, into an extreme distractor. Solely determined, again, into extreme distractor. So pretty straightforward. Arrive to B for question 14. All right, question 15. We have a punctuation question here. We need to understand what every comma is doing. So let's explain what the commas are doing in B. Okay, so which is a correct answer. So we need this first comma here because we have an independent clause. The genre has experienced periodic waves of popular resurgence. And another independent clause. Today it remains a steady presence in underground music scenes. So we need the comma before the and because it is an independent clause. That gets rid of A. B, we have a semicolon, which I guess conceivably you could use with the and, but if we're going to use a comma and a fanboys, there's no need. If we're going to use a fanboys, there's really no need for a semicolon, right? Because we could just use a semicolon. So because we're using the fanboys and we don't want a semicolon, that narrows us down to B and C. So why is B better than C? We need a comma after today because we have a non-essential non-essential phrase from despite shifts in popular music, right? Because what should the sentence really say? Today it remains a steady presence in underground music scenes. So we know from here to here is a non-essential phrase. We have this comma here after music, showing that it's a non-essential phrase using a comma. So we need the comma to begin the non-essential phrase after today, which we have in B, but are lacking in C. So that's how we arrive to B for question 15. All right, so question 16. We are wanting to make sure we underline or understand what the actual subject is that is determining our verb tense. Okay, so I would really highly recommend anytime you're doing questions like this, you highlight the subject. So our subject is the film. Films is plural, right? There's more than one film here. So that immediately gets rid of answer choice D, which would be present tense singular, and B, which is past tense singular. Because B and D are singular, we can get rid of it. Now, we are between, are we going to be in the present tense plural with A or the present tense plural with C? Let's clarify, or sorry, the past tense plural with A, where is past tense, excuse me, or the present tense plural with C as R, right? Well, known as much for blah, 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 blah. When we talk about things that are made in the past, but are existing to this day, they are still existing. The poems of William Shakespeare are still important, right? Because those poems still exist. We would use the present tense because the poems are from the past, but they're discussed today, right? When are they divided? They're divided today, okay? So because we're using that, we know we need to be in the present tense. So that's how we arrive to the present tense plural based off of our subject and the context. So that's how we get C. All right, so question 17 is a modifier placement question. So we are being asked, right? What is motivated to desertion, right? What is motivated to desertion? Is it Mexico and Ireland? No, Mexico and Ireland are not motivated to desertion. Are the festivals motivated to desertion? No. Is the solidarity motivated to desertion? No. Rather, it is the battalion that is motivated to desertion. Okay, so to desert your, so what was this, right? We had the St. Patrick's Battalion, right? Irish immigrants who fought in the US Army and then said, no, we don't actually want to fight for our oppressors. We're going to go and join the Mexicans in fighting the invading American army. All right. So what is the thing that's being taught here in terms of grammar? Well, whatever our like verb is, whatever the thing that's happening, whatever is being motivated, needs to be the subject of this sentence, right? So the subject of the sentence is going to come after being motivated by these things. So the subject is the battalion. So that's the only thing that can go right there is the subject, the battalion. So that's how we arrive at D for question 17 on a modifier placement question. All right, so question 18, we have a punctuation question here. We are basically being asked, how do we connect these two independent clauses? However, the one thing that is in play that is not in every punctuation or independence clause question is a transitional adverb. So you got to make sure that the transition is going with the right side, the correct side of these two clauses. So we know we have two independent clauses, right? These companies no longer design shoes exclusively for runners and hikers. Their styles have been embraced by the fashion world with gore aesthetics, turning technical footwear into streetwear staples. All right. So because we know we have two independent clauses, we know we can't use just a comma because comma would be a comma splice. The other thing we know we can get rid of right away is A. Even though this colon is perhaps okay, we always need our transitional adverb to be basically surrounded by punctuation if it's a true transition, right? So there's this few select words like whereas or while, which are subordinators, which don't need comma. But if it's a transitional adverb like instead, although, or instead, however, yet, examples like that, we need to have a comma on the other side, right? So whether the comma comes before or after depends on whether it's coming in the first or second clause, but it does need a comma, so there's no comma for A, so that's how we get rid of A. So between C and D, what are we pivoting from, right? Are we pivoting, is the sentence saying these companies to hikers? What is our independent? Is what we're pivoting, or what we're pivoting from is their styles, blah, blah, blah. So clearly we are saying instead after, right? Instead of it just being for runners and hikers, these things are in all these other places. So we put instead in that second clause. Also, I'm noticing that hikers shows up twice, which is a little bit of an error. But obviously, I think we can figure out that that's what's going on here with 18. All right, so 19 is a pretty straightforward verb tense question. So we are all in the present tense, okay? It erupts, they cool and drift, and then they solidify before they fall back onto the island surface. So falling is good because this is present tense, ing, Jaron. The infinitive doesn't work, so we can't use to fall. Having fallen would put us in the past tense or past progressive situation, so that doesn't work. And then falls, lighter strands is the subject, or heavier fragments is the subject. So because fragments is plural, we have to make sure that our verb is conjugated to the plural, but falls is in the singular, right? So we have other answer choices which could, or there's other options we could have put here, but they're not offered as answer choices. We could have seen before they fall or something like that. But we're not given that, so we have to use the gerund, which works out perfectly well for B. All right, so question 20 is a punctuation question. We're ultimately checking to see if we have a two independent clauses or how we connect these. We have two independent clauses, right? Unlike other rabbits, pygmy rabbits are capable of excavating, providing shelter. These burrows are essential to their survival in the world. We have two independent clauses. Therefore, using just a comma is a comma splice. So A isn't good because it's a comma splice. B doesn't work because it's a run-on. And C doesn't work because though there is a conjunction, there's no comma, so it's a run-on. A could be correct if there was a fanboys. C would be correct if there was a comma before. but neither of them offer that. So D is our best option. All right, so we've got a comma splice, a run-on, and a run-on. That's where we're at to D for question 20. All right, question 21, we have a transitions question. With these questions, I really want us thinking not about what sounds the best, but thinking about what best explains the relationship and what works and what doesn't work. Okay, so nevertheless, for example, it sounds good, but is it okay? Does it function correctly? No, right? That would be a pivot, right? But we already have a pivot right here. We're not pivoting from a pivot. That doesn't make any sense. Okay. Likewise would mean to build off of a previous claim, but are we saying that the role of libraries has shifted? Likewise, the role of libraries has shifted? That doesn't make sense. We're trying to prove something. Evidently, even though it doesn't sound like it, is a pivot. Okay. Evidently, we use to say kind of like what somebody or something did that was unexpected. Okay, so that's a pivot, which doesn't work. So that's how we get often. It might not be the most sophisticated sounding transition here, but it's the only one that has nothing wrong with it. All right, so for question 22, we are asked a transitions question. We are trying to show the proper relationship of all of these, okay? So what is the relationship between these two units of information? We're saying at one point, they were something, which was protection in wet and muddy environments. But later on, they became fashionable, right? So to show that time thing, we want to have a time transition. We want something that signifies later on, which is what answer choice D does, okay? Moreover, would be to give another example of how they were protection or something like that. Conversely, would mean a pure pivot, right? But we're just trying to show this trajectory over time. So conversely, it doesn't have the time thing. Then as such would say that what came before immediately led to what came after, but we're just trying to show that things change over time. There is no cause and effect relationship between protection and their secondary situation. So D is our best time transition there is. So that's why we go with D. All right, so question 23 is a transitions question. I always want us being deductive in our reasoning, meaning I want us to get rid of answer choices that don't possibly work, right? So what are we saying? The Michelin Guide is kind of interesting, right? Like how is the Michelin Guide, which basically decides like what is a good restaurant, somehow associated with the tire company? How is the tire company that makes Michelin tires the creator of the Michelin Guide? Well, because they made these guidebooks. Okay, so the guidebooks had all these different things to encourage automobile use and therefore encourage the use of Michelin tires. But however, right, somehow the restaurant ratings became a really big deal. And now the Michelin star is associated with Michelin as their real company, which is Michelin tires. So we're looking for some sort of pivot, right, with a bit of time. In contrast, it doesn't make a lot of sense, okay? It wouldn't basically say that in contrast would mean we have two things which are directly opposite, right? One person suggested that the company focus on tires. In contrast, another person said the company should focus on food, something like that, but we don't have a contrast here. Thus would be a cause and effect. It would need to say that what came before is therefore the cause of what comes later, right? But this doesn't directly cause it becoming a defining feature. It's unexpected. Furthermore, would be another point in the same line, which doesn't make sense. So unexpectedly is what works perfectly here for C, even though it is not the most fancy sounding of transitions. So that is how we arrive to C. Remember, using meaning as opposed to just what sounds good. All right, so 24 is the final transitions question from this first module. We are basically being asked to make sense of the relationship between these things. So Traditional symbolism of barn stars has kind of faded. It's no longer a thing that is providing protection or prosperity or whatever for farmers. Now it's more kind of decorative or cute. So this sentence says the connection has faded, and this sentence says, look at how much it's faded, right? So what is the relationship between those two? Emphasis. This second sentence is emphasizing the sentence before. So our transition here needs to show emphasis, right? Which does that? Indeed. Indeed is our classic emphasis, all right? So we want to make sure that we are providing an answer choice which clarifies the relationship as opposed to an answer choice which simply sounds good, all right? So indeed demonstrates that relationship, which is why we need to go with B for question 24. Okay, so question 25, we have a rhetorical synthesis question. We always want to focus on what are they asking us? So we want to highlight his transition from poetry to music. Okay, so there's a lot of information in here, right? We talk about his influences. We talk about how much he was, one of his songs that was really popular. But his biggest thing is that before he became a musician, he was an acclaimed poet. But then he transitioned to music because he believed that songwriting would provide a more sustainable career than poetry. All right. So we want to have an answer choice which talks about, hey, he likes being a poet. He's exploring these themes of spirituality, love, and existential struggle, which are the same as his songs. But he just wanted to have, a sustainable career, which shows that it's choice A, right? A broader audience for his work sounds like a pretty straightforward example of a more sustainable career. And that is why he transitioned from poetry to music. Some parts in these other answer choices just don't seem true. For example, like only briefly, he found it difficult to incorporate these interests into songwriting. No, that's revoked by that. Little influence on his later work. No, that's revoked by all of this. And then D is opposite distractor. He started as a poet and then became a folk singer, not the other way around. So that's how we arrive at A for question 25. All right, so question 26, we have a rhetorical synthesis question. Within your rhetorical synthesis question, we really want to focus on what is exactly being asked. So we are being asked about how these unique animal group names originated. Where do they come from, right? So we're not trying to figure out what they mean or anything like that, but where do they come from? All right, so where do they initially come from? These terms of venery originated in the book of St. Albans, right? Particularly coming from hunting culture and aristocratic traditions. So B says that, right? Courtly education, aristocratic traditions, those are synonymous, right? Hunting culture and hunting culture are synonymous. So that's pretty good, B. All right. A, okay, do we have owls using a parliament? Are owls actually in a parliament? No. Okay. So finally, is for next, terms of venery, are they formalized by zoologists to standardize species classification? No. And finally, D, while a murder of rabbits does seem to be perhaps a Victorian production, the fluffle of rabbits seems to have been coming from internet appeal. So this is part doesn't make sense. This is where you can get rid of D and resolve to B. Just really make sure on these rhetorical synthesis questions, you are answering the question directly. All right, so question 27, it goes over a little bit, by the way. I just didn't quite fit. We want to really, with any rhetorical synthesis question, focus on what exactly we're being asked. All right, so if you missed this question, watch my other rhetorical synthesis question videos, okay, for 26, 25, etc. So we want to understand the connection between the Esalen Institute and Big Sur's cultural significance. All right, so which identifies how Esalen contributed to Big Sur's cultural influence and how Big Sur's cultural significance has existed for a long time. All right, So the correct answer choice needs to show how the Esalen Institute, right, was connected to certain prominent writers and thinkers, right? Huxley, Maslow, and Watts, right? And how Big Sur was partially culturally significant because it was a refuge for spiritual and artistic exploration, right? So, which is our answer choice that does all of this, right? Which includes kind of like creativity, countercultural thought, right? Which does all of this? Answer choice C, right? We see, okay, look, here are our big thinkers, and then here we have countercultural figures and beat writers. It's everything that is associated with Big Sur that we want from this passage, which is how we arrive to C. Okay. What part of B is wrong? Only after the founding. That doesn't make sense, right? When we say it was founded in 1962, but that it gained significance in the 50s, we can't use B, right? What's wrong in A? Instead of, right? Previously associated. This suggests that there is a sort of replacement, right? But as we see here, Esalen intertwines these things. So we can't go with A. Finally, D. D is really clearly wrong. This is really extreme, little connection to literature, philosophy, or psychology. The whole passage is saying, no, Big Sur has all those things. So that's how we get to the end of module 1. Now we arrive to C for this tricky rhetorical synthesis question. And now we move on to module 2. All right, here we are beginning our second module here for test 308. Question 1 is a word and context question. This is a tricky one. This is a very hard one. All right. This is one where we really need to understand the particularities of different vocab words and really know what a vocab word is, okay? So the definitions of these. Correct answer is forlorn. That means lonely, like totally all alone, sad, yearning. It's truly one of the more tragic words we have in English. Okay. Painfully sad or abandoned or lonely, according to Oxford or Webster's. All right. That works perfectly. This is the last lone male of his species whose calls are echoing unanswered in a final, futile attempt to find a mate that no longer exists. All right. This is a brutal passage here about the O. Might be a video you've seen at some point, either as Instagram reel or TikTok or something like that. So forlorn works perfectly, which is why it's correct. Okay. Now, there are other answer choices which if you squint and you really try, it kind of maybe works, but forlorn is perfect. All right. Erudite means really clear, well-dictated, like kind of logical or smart seeming. Okay. If you say someone is very erudite, it means they put their words together well. They say what they mean really clearly. All right. Whimsical, whimsy kind of feels like fantastical. And it usually has a certain lightness to it. When something is whimsical, it's not too heavy, it's not too intense. So whimsical and erudite don't work. Desolate, if you miss number 1, I'm so likely that you chose desolate. Okay. And desolate kind of works here. Okay. It's not the worst answer choice you could have chosen here. But desolate usually talks about a place. Okay. Sometimes we can feel desolate, but forlorn is perfect. Desolate's a little weird because desolate is talking about when it's, typically a place that's deserted, right? The desolate moor you might see in like a Shakespeare talking about like the Scottish lands that no one's on, right? The desert is very desolate. Okay. There's not a lot there. There's no people. Things are desolate when they're absent of people or absent of things, right? Calling the calls themselves desolate isn't like the worst answer choice in the world, but forlorn is better, which is why this question exists. Okay. Remember, this says with the most logical and precise word, not with a logical or some semi-precise word. Forlorn is better. So that's why we go with D. All right, question 2 is another word and context question. We are looking for a word which means fostered, right? We're producing development in others. So questions like this are not necessarily difficult only because of the vocab in them, but also because what does this passage really mean? This passage is basically saying, oh, we are building and producing and expanding and pushing innovation in every like facet of society and culture during the Enlightenment. Science reinforced reason, which reinforced artistry, which reinforced social change, which enforced blah, blah, blah. All right. So, if you missed this answer choice and you chose an answer choice like mimicked, all right, mimicked might work right here. But we're looking for something that means and fits perfectly, right? Look at all of our synonyms throughout. Reinforcing, right? Sparked, fosters, pushing, okay? All of these suggest a push. To mimic means to simply copy, and that doesn't work, right? Epitomized means to show something, the epitome of something, right? To like be a perfect example, a really clear example. Again, does that mean sparked, fostered, pushing, reinforcing? No. Okay. Now we've got promulgated, which if you don't exactly know what that means, it might sound like close, right? We can promote something. It's got a similar prefix to push something, right? You promote something, you push it. However, like this is usually about an idea in terms of promoting. Right? If you promulgate something, you're going around really like advertising it essentially, right? Or pushing for it, like spreading it. It's close to disseminate. Engendered, however, is perfect. All right. Again, this is one of those questions where the best answer choice is perfect. To engender something is to cause or give rise to something else, right? To create, to produce, to push, to spark, to foster. Engendered is a direct synonym with all these other words in here. If you study your vocab, you'll know that, right? You'll know that this is a direct synonym to these other words. If you're not studying your vocab or you've never seen this word engendered before, you won't know that. So that's why we need to make sure we're studying our vocab to work through these word and context questions. All right, question 3 is a classic SAT approach where we have two very commonly confused words. You've all heard about wreaking havoc across entire neighborhoods. Here we have havoc replaced with a very close synonym of disruption. You know, something can wreak havoc, meaning sow or create destruction everywhere. Wreak means to create or produce, right? Wreck means to destroy, all right? You can wreck disruption, meaning to destroy disruption, but that doesn't really logically make sense within the context of this passage, which basically says, while Airbnb started out being this seemingly kind of cool thing, cool alternative to hotels, it's now just another facet of the machine. So it isn't wrecking disruption, it's wrecking neighborhoods, meaning that it's wreaking disruption or creating, right? So commonly confused words, affect versus effect, loathe versus loathe, wreck versus wreck, lie versus lie, right? These are all things that the SAT occasionally asks about. We see it once every couple tests. This is something we put in here. All of these are vocab words. So you should know all of these. However, it's always tricky to keep the difference between Reek and Rec or commonly confused words. It's something we go over in our classes. If this is something you're struggling with, maybe you can ask your tutor or instructor to spend a little time focusing on commonly confused words. All right, question 4 is a word and context question that does some of what the SAT loves to do with these vocab type questions. Notice how every single answer choice begins in a very similar way. Destitute, deluge, detriment, and dearth. Okay. These all have a negative tone, right? Which aligns with the kind of passage as a whole, which is talking about people like the Liver King who advocate for a complete extreme diet, focusing on only one ingredient or excising one ingredient entirely, excise being an SAT word. And then saying that's the key to health. We're trying to say that this is, something negative about this, but what are we trying to say exactly? So a destitute means really poor. A destitute of scientifically valid studies makes no sense, right? Something can be destitute, but you can't have a destitute of something, right? Deluge is a vocab word you need to know. A deluge basically means a downpour, an overwhelming quantity. So it's, kind of has a negative connotation, but in that there's a lot of something. A deluge of scientifically valid studies confirming health benefits of these social media grifty pseudoscience diets, that makes no sense, right? A deluge of valid studies confirming this would say there's an overwhelming amount of studies saying, yeah, eat only meat. Detriment, if something is to the detriment of something, it's again the opposite of the benefit. Okay, that's exactly what that means, which doesn't make any sense here. There is not it doesn't make sense. So that gives us to dearth. What does dearth mean? A dearth means a lack of. There's a dearth of something, it means there's an absence of it or not enough for it to be significant, right? So that works perfectly here. If you're missing this question, this is one of those ones where simply I'd have to say you need to study more vocab. All right, question 5 is our last word in context question on the test, though it is definitely not our last question, which requires vocab as a skill. Ultimately, this is one of those ones where the SAT is pulling a sort of trick they like to do pretty often. It's not a trick exactly, but the correct answer, a word like privation, doesn't really necessarily sound like what it means. Privation is one of those words like we see in our summer and tutoring and target curriculum, a word like to declaim something. Declaim, you might think, means the opposite of declaim something, but really means to go on for a long time about something. It means like to give a long speech. Privation might sound like it means to be private, okay? But what does privation really mean? It means kind of like scarcity or poverty, okay? Privation means like a lack of something, okay? So it is not, it's not what we would imagine it to be, but that's what the term is. It's in our vocab list. It's something we've seen mentioned about the SAT. It's a word that we need to know. All right. Indulgence is an opposite distractor here. Okay. We're basically saying all of these beautiful regional dishes came because of scarcity, right? These things that we love, such as slow cooking, Chinese fermentation and curing, gravy. These are all things from trying to make cheap ingredients taste better or make longer or make like certain ingredients last a longer time or go further. Okay, so indulgence is the opposite, right? We're not indulging in all of these things. We're coming from a place of scarcity. Innovation kind of fits the idea, right? We're saying like, yeah, they're innovating, right? They're taking these things, making them last a long time. But that isn't what the meaning of this passage is saying. right? The meaning here needs to talk about scarcity, right? Stretching limited things, transforming tough cuts, extending food supplies. We're trying to say there wasn't a lot of something, right? But it was managed to make good, okay? They're rooted in long-standing issues of lacking, right? Then abundance, like indulgence, these are both opposite distractors. If you read this kind of the opposite way, if you missed the meaning of this passage, which is, completely possible, completely understandable, you're going to go with abundance in the opposite way. But what we're looking for is to say ultimate scarcity. So privation is a word that we just need to know. I think we could arrive to privation, though, even if we don't know what indulgence, or even if we don't know what privation means, by getting rid of indulgence, innovation, and abundance, right? Because we know that none of those words mean scarcity. So that's the final word and context question on the test. All right, so question 6 here is our cross-text connections question, a cross-text analysis. These are usually one of the 3 or 4 trickiest questions on the SAT reading and writing, but luckily they're not very common on the test. From all the practice tests I've seen from the College Board, there's usually 1 per test. I've heard that on an official test there was maybe 2 or 3 at most. So they can't account for anywhere near as much of your grade as being amazing at grammar, amazing at vocabulary, really understanding transitions, etc. However, these are important questions to nail if you're trying to be one of those top performing students. So how do we approach a question like this? Well, we have to understand the main idea of both passages. I'll take it that you read both of these passages. And they are both, they're similar but different, okay? How are they similar? They both are focused on the fact that teen girls get a lot of criticism from older generations because of the way they speak or the way they talk, right? Whether it's, ways of texting or vocal fry or what have you. Teen girls, for a long time, generations have been blamed for, or teens in particular, have been blamed for kind of making language new and different. They've been disliked for it. So they both focus on that problem, or that issue, but they take a very different perspective towards that issue. Text 1 seems to say woohoo about the way that teenagers change language. It's saying there's nothing better than the fact that they change language. In fact, they are language disruptors. Whoa. Innovators. You invent new words, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Whereas text 2 says, they're actually not all that innovative. Everyone sees them that way, but it's not the fact that they're teens that makes a big deal. It's just that it's overstated, right? They don't have as much of an impact as we might think. So our question asks, on which of the following points would the authors of the text most likely agree? It's gonna have to be something along the lines of the fact that teenagers are blamed for changing languages, or they are critiqued or criticized for the way that they change or use language, right? Which is exactly C. Older generations tend to be overly critical of the way teenagers use language, right? Both texts very clearly say this, right? A is true for the second text, but not the first one, right? Do not play a more significant role than other age groups. That is something that text 2 seems to suggest, but text 1 doesn't. Text 1 seems to say this, right? This is true for text 1, but is that true for text 2? No. So B is true for text 1, but not text 2. A is true for text 2, but not text 1. And then D is kind of, maybe true for text 1, but it seems to be a reading of this that goes deeper than we need to, right? They should be more directly encouraged by society as a whole. Innovation should be more directly encouraged by society as a whole. Neither of these passages seem to suggest that, like, there should be a goal to change things, okay? So really just take these texts one at a time, find the main idea, and then answer the question. It's a simple approach, but it's the only one that's going to produce the right result. All right, question 7 is going to be one of the hardest questions on this test, right? The other poem questions hard, the cross-text analysis is hard, a couple command of evidence questions are hard. This poem here is it's a hard question. It's a beautiful poem, though. All right, so let's understand what it's saying. We can read it again. The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Okay. We're translating this. Our world, the world of human society, is too ingrained in us. We care too much about it. We spend too much time getting and spending things, and we are destroying or laying waste, wasting what's really important for us, right? We've given our hearts away, a sordid boon, right? So nature that doesn't reflect our real world, our human world, because we see them as distinct. And in trying to take from nature or, ignoring nature, whatever it is, we are making money, a boon, but it's sordid, it's bad, right? So these beautiful things of nature are just things that are gathered because it moves us not, right? We are not moved by the beauty, by the importance of nature, because we want to see everything as in something we can take or make use of. Everything needs to be utilized according to this, right? Then finally, Wordsworth says, and this is, pretty out there stuff for the 1800s. Remember, like, this is not too much long after people were being burned alive for being witches or pagans. Okay, great God, I'd rather be a pagan, right? Suckled in a creed outworn. I'd rather be a pagan believing in a belief system that doesn't really exist anymore, so that I, standing on this pleasant lea, like kind of like a meadow, could have glimpses that make me less forlorn. Look, a vocab word that was earlier in this test that you may have missed. That'd make me feel less bad. To see something as powerful, to see something as powerful as Proteus rising from the sea, right? So the same way that we could see the moon rising from the ocean, or old Triton blowing his wreathed horn, the same thing as winds howling at all hours, right? So he wants to feel the power of nature the way that we may have in the past, where we see God or the gods embedded within nature itself, in a deep and moving way. And that might be the thing that brings him out of his sadness, his profound, deep forlornness. And it is remarkably distinct from the way that he sees the rest of humans navigating the world, in which their world, the human world, is the only priority. All right. So I'm going to get rid of a few answer choices, right? B, to introduce readers to the poem to pagan gods, such as Proteus and Triton, in an attempt to convert those readers to the ancient religious practice that he believes in. He is saying, he's not saying, like, come be a pagan with me, right? There's no indication that he actually is a pagan. He says, I'd rather be a pagan than live like many of us live in modern society. That kind of infers or suggests that he is not, in fact, a pagan. Right? C is wrong because of this word, causal link. Right? A causal link means one thing causes another. So to establish a causal link between the power that nature has on people with the power of ancient gods, such as Proteus and Triton, seems to suggest that the power of nature comes from the power of these ancient gods. He's not saying that these gods actually exist. He's making kind of an extended metaphor where he's saying, look, I want to see these things that we can see nowadays, the sea and the winds, with the eyes of someone who can be so moved by them that they see the gods within that nature. He is not suggesting that it is Proteus who's rising from the sea, actually. Triton, that the winds we hear howling actually comes from Triton blowing his horn. Okay. So now we're between A and D. And this is not a vocab question. It's not a word in context question, at least. But there is one vocab word which clearly makes A wrong, even though it looks really good. To deify. Okay, to deify modern society for its overexploitation of nature and pursuit of consumer spending and industrial production. If DI meant condemn, criticize, lambast, whatever it might be that's in the negative, you could not get rid of A. It would totally be correct. But it says deify. Where does that word come from? Deity, God. To deify something means to exalt it, to hold it up, to say, this is great. When you deify something, you're saying, this is amazing, right? Certain figures get deified over the course of time, right? Like they become like gods, right? Like in literature, it would be Shakespeare, you know, he's deified, he's almost a god, right? It's like being made a saint or something. In ancient societies, they literally were deified, right? Like, the pharaohs were so godlike, people started saying, well, maybe they are a god, okay? Is he deifying modern society, saying this is the best thing ever? It's so dope how modern society overexploits nature in pursuit of consumer spending and industrial production? Definitely not. All right. So that's why we get rid of A. So again, we need to be looking for what's wrong. A is perfect except for one single word. And that one single word makes A really bad. Right. So then we look at D. To show his yearning for meaning and serenity that he believes can be found through the power of nature as opposed to the frivolity of modern society. What does that mean? It means he wants to feel something that would make him not sad anymore, that he thinks he can only find by looking at the sea, hearing the winds, compared to the getting and spending that the world is of the world that is too much with us, right? That's good too. Okay. So be deductive. Get rid of answer choices that don't work. And with these poems, try to translate them if you need to. Okay, they give us some tricky old poems on occasion. You just have to translate them into a language that you understand in order to answer these questions. So that's how we arrive to D for this question. All right, question 8 is a very tricky question, but it's one where if we stay really diligent in seeing what's asked of us, it isn't the hardest thing in the world. All right, this is what we call a detail question, where it says according to the text. We're getting directly into the text here. So we are asked, I'm going to highlight it. What is the link between the premaxilla and mammalian noses? All right, so let's go into the text and find premaxilla anywhere it's mentioned. So here we have the premaxilla, an ancestral jawbone. And here we have the nose, right? So this is about mammalian evolution. So the premaxilla was lost and its region repurposed to form the nose. Okay. So all this other stuff, does this talk about the premaxilla? This is about the creation of jawbones here. So jawbones, 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 craniofacial disorders, etc. Right? We are asked something very direct and specific about this passage, which is, how did the premaxilla relate to mammalian noses? Now, that doesn't mean that when you read this question, you're only going to look here and you're not going to read the passage as a whole. It's good to know what the passage is saying. What does it basically say? Our jawbones actually didn't directly come from reptiles. Rather, the ancestral jawbone turned into the nose, and something new, right, that was a small bone in the nasal cavity in reptiles, turned into the new mammalian jaw. So the mammalian jaw didn't inherit directly from a reptilian jaw. It actually came in a kind of indirect way, and the reptilian jaw kind of later turned into the nose. All right. But what are we just really focusing on though? That the premaxilla was lost and that area turned into the nose, which is exactly what we see with C, right? The premaxilla was lost during mammalian evolution and its former location became part of the nasal structure. That's a direct, almost verbatim quote from the text, right? So A is wrong because it says premaxilla remained, but it didn't remain. It says it was lost. Okay. B is confusing because something fused, right, with the incisivum, I don't know how to pronounce that, to create the nasal cavity, perhaps, in something, right? But it's not, one, it didn't create the nasal cavity, it created the new jaw. The incisivum is the new jaw. It's not exactly correct, but we see all these terms, right? This is a classic example. B is a classic example of the recycled language distractor, where just by using language we see in the text, we think, ooh, that must be good. Not what we got here. Then 5, the vomer bone, right, is again something that is seen in the text, and it is a central role in mammalian jaw structure, jaw function. But again, the premaxilla disappeared. Okay, so you just have to focus on what the terms actually mean. You create you use these terms to understand something. Watch out on these according to the text questions, these detailed questions. Always watch out for recycled language. That's what we see time and again. Question 9 is a main idea question. We're asked to understand the main idea of the text, okay? So we want to find something. Sometimes the main idea is found with a direct, specific thesis statement. But that's not always the case. This passage has a little bit of a thesis statement, right? Which is that, a sacred incident played a pivotal role. However, and then this here, right? So this is kind of the thesis, if you would. They ordered his troops to excuse me, ordered his troops to avoid damaging the mulberry trees, which endeared the Mongol leader to the Chinese people. All right, so now the bigger thing here is that sometimes the main idea is conveyed over the passage as a whole, and the best thing we can do is look for distractors that do not work, right? Look for answer choices which are just clearly wrong. They have something wrong with it, right? So, ensuring long-term stability rather than immediate military dominance. Where do they say that they don't pursue military dominance, right? Seems like the Mongols invaded and conquered China. Now, it sought to strengthen China's economy as well. By not destroying the mulberries, is he improving China's economy or is he just protecting it from destruction? Parts of that are just not right, okay? B, we have an extreme distractor here. Primarily motivated by a desire to control the silk trade and expand economic influence. Where on earth is that stated in the passage? Okay, we don't want to infer too wildly for our main idea questions, right? Let's keep it to the text. C, everything here is true, right? It gained favor with the local population, right? Which made Mongol rule easier. That's exactly what we see here, right? Smoother conquests and integration, okay? Also, it preserved the silk industry, right? So it preserved the silk industry and made people like Kublai Khan. So that's nothing wrong with C. And then D, the silkworm was considered a sacred insect in the, here's the incorrect part, the Mongol culture, all right? That part is an issue because we're talking about the Chinese people, right? It was China and Chinese people who thought the silkworm was sacred, and Kublai Khan just didn't destroy that. But Kublai Khan's leader was the leader of the Mongols. They're the ones who were conquered. So always look for things that are wrong in answer choices and get rid of them to arrive to our correct answer, which is how we get to C. All right, so question 10 is one of those questions which I think the SAT includes so that students will have their eyes glaze over. They completely check out and they just ultimately spend a lot of time on a question without spending a ton of effort on it, and they just choose an answer choice that ultimately they didn't really determine based off of the text. Okay, why? Because we see a bunch of jargon, a bunch of technical language that we just do not like. Okay, ytterbium atoms, ytterbium orthovanadate, qubits or qubits, quantum bits, nanoscale structures designed to capture and guide light, reliably entangled and manipulated within a single network node. Like, what the dickens does any of this mean? It seems highly complicated, right? And it is. But we're asked something very specific, which we can get just by understanding the logical structure of a passage. What is the most significant consequence of embedding ytterbium atoms within yttrium orthovanadate? Okay, why does embedding these ytterbium atoms within yttrium orthovanadate important? Okay, well, let's read, right? They achieved entanglement multiplexing, okay, in a quantum network, right? This is an advancement. So it's important because they advanced quantum communication by getting entanglement multiplexing in a single network. How did they do this? They did this by embedding ytterbium atoms within yttrium orthovanadate, all right? So what they did created this situation which allowed for entanglement, blah, blah, blah. What does that mean? Well, what's otherwise highlighted in pink. This breakthrough allowed for a stable host environment that preserves the quantum coherence of ytterbium atoms, which allows multiple qubits, right, which is, again, a quantum bit, to be reliably entangled and manipulated within a single network node. All right, now what does that mean? Why is this? We don't really totally need to know. We just need to know that this is what the consequence of connecting yttrium orthovanadate and ytterbium atoms does. This is the consequence. The consequence is a stable host environment that allows multiple qubits to be reliably entangled and manipulated within a single network node. We don't need to know exactly what that means, honestly. We just need to know that it happens, and this is the thing that this embedding accomplishes. That's the big deal, okay? Now, what does this do for everything? Well, it basically allows for improved communication rates, right? So communication rates were limited because of the time required to prepare qubits and transmit photons. By allowing multiplexing, it overcomes a bottleneck in this transmission of, or preparation and transmission of qubits and photons. This bottleneck is overcome by entanglement multiplexing, which is what embedding this atom inside this other chemical allows, right? What does this do? It allows this to be more efficient. Okay, so the big conclusion is that it's more efficient. All right. So what are some things that we don't see here? Replaces the need for photon transmission. Where does it say replaces the need for photon transmission, right? No, it just allows for the simultaneous preparation of qubits and transmission of photons. Transmission of photons is still happening, right? Replacing is not true. Okay. This part, where do they talk about greater flexibility in quantum system design? This isn't addressed whatsoever. It is talking about the efficiency of quantum networks. We don't know whatsoever if qubits are functioning independently of their host material, right? We're just saying that efficiency of quantum networks is increased because we can simultaneously prepare qubits and transmit photons. They're able to happen at the same time because of the reliable entanglement and manipulation of multiple qubits within just one single network node, which is what B says. B says directly what's right here, right? And then finally, A, again, we have just like another like recycled language distractor that just says entirely independent of light-based systems. Like what? Where does this come in? I mean, we say that photons are still required. If photon is a light-based thing, right? Are we able to get rid of it entirely? That doesn't suggest it anywhere. Okay. So something wrong with A, C, and D, nothing wrong with B. It's directly stated in the passage. It's the big breakthrough. It's the consequence. And if we understand what the passage is saying, we read through it logically and we spend our time and we're smart, we got this, right? So just input your time. However, if you're finding yourself just laboring on a question like this and you feel like there's no hope, don't spend 4 or 5 minutes on a question like this at the consequence or the cost of not being able to do any other question. Okay, so that's how we get to. All right, question 11 is a command of evidence question. It's relatively tricky. We need to understand what is the researcher's hypothesis. So the researcher's hypothesis is that temperature fluctuations, precipitation patterns, and nutrient loading are key drivers of lacustrine color shift. So lake color shifts are because of these issues. And they argue that reducing human impact at local and regional and global levels could reduce this color shift. Okay, so it's a consequence of temperature fluctuations, altered participation patterns, invasive species, and other human things. But if we reduce human impact, we could reduce the color shift, right? So what would weaken that hypothesis? Okay, well, one way to weaken the hypothesis, well, let's go through these. So A would say that high latitude lakes that have undergone the least color shift are more typically physically isolated, suggesting that human activity is an insignificant factor. Okay, that part is unclear, right? That would mean the opposite. Okay. Why is this wrong? Basically, A says human activity doesn't impact color shift in lakes because we see physically isolated lakes having less change, right? That is an opposite, right? We would say that if that were true, human activity would be a significant factor. Okay, so this wouldn't weaken, this would improve their hypothesis. A is logically incoherent with itself, all right? B is logically incoherent because we are basically making a baggage distractor. Increased water clarity in bodies of water is a positive ecological development. Where does it say this in the passage, right? How would we know this, right? Increased water clarity is not necessarily a good thing, right? It is inversely correlated, okay? As we see here. Okay, C, human-induced nutrient loading has been proposed as a key driver of color shift, but the most significant changes have shown stable or decreasing nutrient levels over the study period. So this doesn't reduce or weaken their hypothesis because ultimately decreasing or stable nutrient levels isn't the only thing that could change color or cause color shift, right? Nutrient levels is perhaps a key driver, but it is not the key driver, right? The key driver is none of them, right? All of these could impact from temperature fluctuation, precipitation pattern, invasive species, and nutrient loading, right? So nutrient levels might not be the only thing that does this. Also, decreasing nutrient levels can change lake color. Finally, D, lakes with no indication of environmental differences between them, such as all of these, okay, invasive species or levels of nutrient changes, and with similar geographic location and climatic conditions have shown opposite changes, right? So things which could be directly compared, they have the same invasive species, they have the same nutrient changes, they have the same precipitation patterns, they have the same geographies, they have the same climatic conditions. All of these things, all the same, and yet one of them has an opposite they have opposite trends and color shifts. That suggests, well, maybe there's something else driving these color shifts, right? Maybe reducing human impact won't change color shift, and maybe these things aren't actually causing color shift. It must be something else. So if D were true, it actually would weaken what is here. So that is why D is our best answer choice. It is not logically incoherent with itself, nor is it logically incoherent with the passage. That's how we arrive to it. All right, so question 12. This is a little bit tricky for me to go through here because the image is smaller on my form than it will be on TestPress for you guys. But ultimately, we're asked, how do we synthesize information from the text and from the figure to make a logically valid claim? So what do we see in the text? We see that childhood immunizations are relatively partisan, right? Democratic and Democratic leaning people think childhood vaccinations are extremely important at a higher rate than Republican counterparts. So 31% of Republicans say vaccines are more dangerous than the diseases they were designed to protect, whereas 5% of Democrats say the same. Okay, so there's a partisan issue driving to some degree differing opinions on the importance or the value of vaccinations for children. Now, when we look at the figure, we see how vaccination status has changed from pre-pandemic to 2023 to 2024, right? We see many states, the overall average of vaccination rates for measles childhood has gone down a lot, but there's a few examples of opposites, such as Alabama going way up, improved, Kansas being improved, Maine being improved, and then some states which had really high pre-pandemic vaccination rates, such as West Virginia and New York. Shout out West Virginia, where I was born. And those not really changing. And then other states such as California, Massachusetts, and some others changing very little. All right. So we don't want to presume too much. Okay. We want to make a logically valid claim. All right, so now are some of these things are just not true. Okay, so how do we know that A is not true? Well, how would we, if vaccination validity, belief in vaccinations has decreased significantly among people with Republican leanings? Well, we could not say that a state such as Alabama or Kansas has higher densities of Republicans than a state like Alaska or Wisconsin. Why can we not say that? Because a state like Alabama increased in vaccination rates from the pandemic, and a state like Alaska decreased in vaccination rates, or Wisconsin decreased significantly in vaccination rates since the pandemic. Okay, so childhood vaccination rates between these two states, because they go in different directions, we could not presume that a state like Alabama has a higher density of Republicans because it doesn't square with this. That can't be the cause, okay? It's a correlation, not causation issue there. All right. Now, something like B, right? Mississippi had a really high pre-COVID vaccine rate, but it dropped much more significantly than a state like, if we zoom in, where, in a state like Connecticut or Maine, both of which increased their vaccination rates following the pandemic, right? So how would we be able to say, we could not presume that a state like Mississippi or West Virginia has a higher density of Democrats than a state like Maine or Connecticut, because Mississippi's vaccination rate, though it started out higher, went down after the pandemic. Whereas a state like Maine or Connecticut, those vaccination rates went up, meaning we can't compare those two. So both A and B basically provide impossible comparisons, right? Now, C, we have something just purely wrong. Increased national enthusiasm for vaccination within democratic populations. That's not correct based on the information in the text, because it says that democratic populations saw a decrease in vaccination beliefs, right? It decreased. So finally, the only one which is left is D. right? Generally, states across the United States, which we see from this average here, saw a decrease in from pre-pandemic to current baselines of childhood vaccinations due to general decreases in the general population's valuation of the importance of vaccines, particularly among Republican populations. This seems to square with what we see here. If the average goes down, that means as a whole, people have a lower valuation, right? How do we know this is true? Well, the Democratic grouping had fallen slightly, whereas those who lean Republican had plunged. In both instances, it goes down, which connects to it going down as an average overall. So this question is actually a lot more straightforward than it might seem. I don't want you using baggage distractors such as knowing, well, Alabama's really Republican, right? Or, California's really very Democrat, right? To select A or B. Just use the information that you can logically infer from the passage, which is if a state's vaccination rate drops precipitously, it likely has something to do with a density of Republicans, or if a state's vaccination rate drops very minimally, it might have something to do with Democrats, but we can't know that for sure. That's a leading, that's not how we analyze data in the real world. So that's what we wrote to D for question 12. All right, so question 13 here is a lot more straightforward than you might expect. Okay, so we're asked to understand or to support the researchers' conclusions about mollusk evolutionary history. All right, so what is their perspective? That the mollusks split early into two major groups, Achiliophora and Conchophora. So what would demonstrate that? Well, that genetic analysis reveals that they diverged earlier than suggested by morphological studies alone, right? This is what they did, right? So that can't be wrong. Can't be anything wrong with B. Fossil records saying they're more closely related to cephalopods doesn't really have anything to do with this, right? We're trying to say that they split earlier than would suggest. We don't want to see a uniform rate of evolution across environments. We want to see that they split. And then D would be a opposite distractor because we don't want a more common ancestor than mollusks and arthropods. We want the opposite, right? So that's how we get to B here. If you're struggling on a question like this, you're probably getting bogged down in like these jargon things such as annelid worms and arthropods and mollusks and cylindropods and monophylacophorans or whatever the heck all this stuff says. Really, we're just saying, look, what would support it? More evidence that supports it. B. So just stay simple with a question like 13. All right, so question 14, we're asked to logically complete the text. So what does our text say? It ultimately says that symbiotic relationships are really important for orchids. And what we see typically with this one, right, whatever this species, however you would pronounce that, would form relationships with fungi to supplement nutrient intake. However, when there is a wood decomposing fungi, they get a lot more nutrient uptake with more abundant flowering. So ultimately, what we would say is that it's beneficial for these orchids to develop an association with wood decomposing fungi. So it's good for them to be near decaying wood, but they're only going to switch over to associating with wood decomposing fungi as opposed to root inhabiting fungi if they are near decaying wood. So what answer choice says that? B. So A is wrong because other nutrient sources, it's not, if A were to be true, it would need to be basically that they go to wood decomposing fungi only if everything else isn't available. That would be a last option, right? Last case option. But we see that it's actually the opposite, right? They go to wood decomposing fungi if it's available anyway, right? So if the other nutrient, regardless of other nutrient resources, they're going to prioritize wood decomposing fungi if they're close enough, right? We don't know if they're competing with other plants. This is kind of like a just complete distractor. This is just not in the text at all. And then finally, frequent shifts in symbiotic associations. It seems like these shifts aren't necessarily frequent. It's just if there's a wood decomposing fungi nearby, they're going to queue up on it. And if not, then they're going to stick with their typical root inhabiting fungi. So B is the only one which basically says, hey, if there's decomposing wood near this orchid, they're going to use the fungi from that decomposing wood because it leads to more abundant flowering. So that's how we arrive to B. All right, so question 15 is a punctuation question that's talking about the topic of elaborations. Okay, so if you missed this question, I want you to find either in Hamilton materials or with your tutor or online information about elaborations as a topic and really look into what they do. All right, so what is an elaboration? It's ultimately a piece of information that's tacked onto the end of a sentence. Everything before that piece of information can be a complete sentence. And it's going to be tacked on following punctuation of either a dash or a colon. All right, so C does everything correctly. And then we are given a colon to create elaboration. Everything from while to value could be its own sentence. Then conformity to breed standards is the final thing we need for an elaboration, which is describes what is valued ahead of it. All right, or the definition ahead of it. A doesn't work because conformity to breed standards can't be its own complete sentence, right? That's why a semicolon, anything like that wouldn't work. B is a complete run-on. And then D is, you can't use a comma to create an elaboration. You can use commas to tack things on to the, like to finish a sentence, but you can't do it in this exact way. Here you would use for pure elaboration where the sentence should end at that value, but we just want to clarify what's valued. We want to use a real elaboration with a colon or a dash. So question 16 does a very typical SAT thing in which our verb, which is over here, and our subject, which is up here, are really far apart. And our subject and our subject is not the most clear. Okay, so our subject is not, I'm going to cross out in red. Our subject is not Jimmy Cliff, right? Our subject is the contrasting personas, are the contrasting personas, all right? So that means our subject is plural. Now, that's difficult to tell because one, there's this huge non-essential phrase, and two, there's a name. So that makes it hard to tell that the subject is really contrasting personas. So if you're missing a question like this, I really suggest you underline or highlight your actual subject. So personas needs to be plural. That means we can get rid of exists and was existing, both of which are singular. Now, B is a tense which suggests that these personas once existed, but no longer exist. Whereas D suggests that these personas still exist. And it does still exist. This persona still does exist, right? How do we know that? It continues to shape this public image. So that is how we arrive to the plural present tense as opposed to any singular tenses or any past type tenses. All right, 17 is a really hard punctuation question that I'm sure many of us missed. Even though this question is not necessarily difficult to get correct, it is very easy to miss. Okay, what do I mean by that? I mean, in your reading through this, you see a name after a title, right? My teacher, comma, Rio, comma. Whenever we see a title and a name, we just immediately jump to the conclusion of, oh, this is a non-essential phrase. Let me throw the name within a pair of commas and move on, right? But we can only do that if the name is actually a non-essential phrase, if the name actually doesn't need to be in the sentence. But in this case, Lars von Trier, co-founder and filmmaker from the Dogma 95 movement, needs to be in this sentence. Why does it need to be in this sentence? Because the subject is movement co-founder and filmmaker Lars von Trier. He is part of the subject, and the subject needs to be in the sentence. How do we know? How can we tell? We'll read it. Movement co-founder and filmmaker challenges the movement's original ideals in his own films. Doesn't that just sound wrong? Right now, sounding wrong doesn't always reveal what's right or wrong, but it can kind of point us in the right direction. Why does that sound wrong? Because movement co-founder and filmmaker challenges, there's no subject there. Movement co-founder and filmmaker can't be a subject. So we need Lars von Trier to be part of this so that we can keep it within the subject. So A is wrong because it's a non-essential phrase. B is wrong because we don't need a comma before Lars von Trier, right? Movement co-founder and filmmaker, Lars von Trier challenges, right? That creates a comma splice. And then C is incorrect because the second comma creates a non-essential phrase from challenges to films, which doesn't make sense because it would then say movement co-founder and filmmaker Lars von Trier often bending or abandoning dogmas, rigid rules, blah, blah, blah. So that also doesn't make sense. So all of that coalesces to say that D is correct. Lars von Trier is the subject. It has to be in there, no commas. All right, so 18 is a punctuation question. We're being asked, how do you fulfill a long, basically a long non-essential phrase? So if you're missing a question like this, I want you to go and study non-essential phrases, okay? We know that non-essential phrases have to start and end with the same punctuation mark. So depending on, we see that we start our non-essential phrase with a comma. That means our non-essential phrase has to end with a comma. Looking through here, we see that only one ends with a comma, okay? So that on its own should help us get rid of A, B, and C, all right? Now, a lot of us might have been thrown off by trying to figure out, okay, can I do this? Parentheses in between? Yeah, you can. You can have a non-essential phrase within a non-essential phrase. That doesn't determine that something is not a non-essential phrase. All right. So all we really need to think is the show, which was aired during prime time slots on public television networks. That is our non-essential phrase. This non-essential phrase we can ignore ultimately because they're the same between all of them. So because we start with a comma and we end with a comma, we have to go D. Really simplify your approach. What am I being asked here? If you're missing a question like this, am I being asked about non-essential phrases? If so, you know what you need to do. Question 19 is about as classic of a tricky SAT grammar question as I could possibly see. Okay, this is a subject-verb agreement question. What is the subject? Each of his most personally important actors. Okay, each, time and again, students forget, each is singular. Okay, so because each is singular, we need to make sure that our answer choice is conjugated into the singular. So each appears is singular. Each appear is plural. Were appearing is plural. Had appeared is singular. Now, why is appears in the present tense better than had appeared in the past tense? Well, these films still exist. They still appear. They still happen. So their appearances continue. Just like with most art, we want to make sure we are doing things in the present tense the same way that Shakespeare writes. We would say that these people appear, or each appears, because each is the subject, which is singular. So we need to make sure we choose the singular verb appears. All right, so 20 is a modifiers question. We need to make sure that our subject is what is doing or associated is the object of the verb that's happening in the sentence. So what is more than just an abstraction of physics? Okay, what is more than just an abstraction of physics? The topic, which is torsion, right? Torsion is more than just an abstraction of physics. It allows certain things to take place. So the only So we have two answer choices which don't have torsion as the subject. So we can get rid of A and B because weapons are not an abstraction of physics. Weapons is not the subject we're looking for, nor is wind tightly round. Okay. Now, between C and D, well, torsion is the subject for both C and D. C says something incorrect, right? Doesn't more than just an abstraction of physics, torsion increased when fibers were tightly wound that allowed armies. That doesn't make any sense, right? That's logically incoherent. Okay. But D says our subject is torsion, and that this torsion allowed armies to dominate the battlefield, right? So perfect for D. This is a modifiers question. If you're missing this, I want you to review modifiers with your tutor or your instructor. All right, so 21 is a very tricky question for students. We have a lot of plural, possessive, singular possessive, all of these sort of things in consideration. All right, so first we need to see, is the dry lake bed plural or singular? We're talking about the Salton Sea, one inland body of water. So that means that we only have one dry lake bed, okay? A is wrong because if the apostrophe comes after the S, that means that the dry lake bed, there's more than one. D is wrong because if the apostrophe is after the S, that means there is more than one dry lake bed, okay? So we have narrowed down to B and C because we know that the Salton Sea is singular, so there is only one dry lake bed, and the apostrophe before the S designates that the dry lake bed is singular. Now, we are saying, is the alkali flats possessive or is it not possessive? So, this is incorrect, what they have. It says the answer here is C, but it should be D because the flats possess this chemical laden toxic dust. So that is how we arrive there. All right, question 22 is a transitions question. So we want to make sure we're thinking about the relationship between what comes before and what comes after. So make sure you read this passage as a whole. If you are going to do a transitions question, you have to understand the context of the passage as a whole. So we see that, public attire has changed a lot. COVID made comfort a priority. Some hoped that compelling fashion would come as a result of the pandemic, but results suggest otherwise. Loosened expectations did not stop at mere comfort. They spiraled into outright disregard. Then we want to see a therefore, a cause and effect. Thus, as such, it is now common to see people in public wearing pajamas, slippers, and even blankets, as if they had rolled out of bed and abandoned the last vestiges of self-respect. Okay, so we need to understand that thereafter does not mean therefore. Okay, it is not a cause and effect transition. Thereafter means after a certain point. Regard this as a pivot, and by comparison, is also typically a pivot. Right? So, what is our cause and effect transition category here? Hence. Right? Hence is not the most common of these, but it's one we probably know. Thus, as such, therefore, hence. Okay. So we want that cause and effect, and hence agrees as a cause and effect, which is why we result in choosing C. All right, so question 23 is a transitions question. Talks about a very sad subject here, which is Southwest Airlines abandoning free bags. Bags fly free, which used to be their ultimate slogan. So what is this passage saying? Recently, activist venture capitalists, so like investors with big right-wing political beliefs, on the airline's board have pushed for a strategic shift, arguing that introducing baggage fees will boost revenue and bring Southwest in line with industry norms. Then we see something saying the opposite, a pivoting or contrasting information sentence. Critics argue that abandoning free bags undermines the airline's core identity and forces it into an unwinnable race to the bottom, with the potential of long-term reputational damage that could destroy the airline. So the capitalists think that it will be good because it will boost revenue and bring them with industry norms. Yay. Critics say, on the other hand, that it will could destroy the airline. So we have a clear pivot here. So we need an answer choice which shows a pivot. What does that? Alternately. All right. On the other hand, alternately. In effect, would need to describe the sentence that came before. In other words, doesn't work. Moreover means an additional element of the previous example or claim, which we don't have. And consequently is a cause and effect. Which again, these are two polar opposite perspectives. So something like alternately is the only one that we can use. So that's why we go with A. All right, question 24 about a grifter. Someone who positioned herself as a champion of American conservative values and criticized foreign interference in U.S. affairs. However, had received $10 million in covert funding from a foreign interfering external propaganda state-controlled media company. Right. So what we have here is it says she continued to promote nationalist rhetoric and decry or say no good about foreign meddling, but organization was still directly funded by a foreign adversary. Okay, so moreover doesn't make sense here, even though if it sounds good. Why doesn't moreover make sense? It is not a natural extension of the fact that she promoted national rhetoric and decried foreign meddling. Moreover would need to say, moreover, she said X, Y, and Z, which is along the same lines of decrying foreign meddling and nationalist rhetoric. Now, it is common for people who have those beliefs to be grifters that are, just saying those things in order to, have clout online or something like that. But that doesn't mean that it's still logically what you would expect to follow. So moreover doesn't work. Regardless would be just kind of a unconsequential pivot, right? We say regardless, that means like don't consider what came before. Doesn't make sense. All the while is perfect, right? Sort of is, the most ironic answer here, saying while she was promoting rhetoric and decrying foreign meddling, she was being funded by a foreign meddler, right? Consequently, it is not a natural effect to be funded by a foreign adversary if you believe in opposition to foreign meddling. Okay, so that's where we arrive to all the while and get rid of all the other answer choices. All right, question 25 is a rhetorical synthesis question. That means we really need to focus on the question, all right? The student wants to explain why sodium carbonate is significantly present in alkali flat environments. So why do we see so much sodium carbonate in alkali flat environments? All right, so, well, we see here, it forms through the evaporation of mineral-rich water in closed basin lakes, leaving behind concentrated salt deposits. Okay, so this is why we see them there, because there's nowhere else for it to go in a closed basin. So we get rich salt deposits there. Remember, salt doesn't mean a table salt. Sodium carbonate is a salt, right? So don't confuse salt with table salt here. So, do we know that table salt cannot be found in closed basin lake environments? No, we don't. Okay. B, is it true that sodium carbonate can be a problematic pest as an airborne dust? Yes. But does that explain why it is so present in alkali flats? No. C, is this true? Yes, it was essential to Egypt's ancient civilization. But is that why it was significantly present in alkali flats? No. Okay, so this word significant is it showing up in a different way. So don't fall for a baggage distractor. Finally, D, perfect, right? It accumulates at significant levels because of the evaporation of mineral-rich water in closed basin lakes. This directly aligns with the bullet point we want. That's how we get D for 25. All right, so question 26 is a rhetorical synthesis question. We want to explain the primary differences between Cannes and Sundance. All right, so we want to focus on differences. Okay, so let's focus on where the differences are. Okay, so Sundance is in the USA, Cannes is in France. Cannes focuses on artistic from established directors, whereas Sundance focuses on American independent cinema, right? Both focus on artistic merit that maybe have unconventional or non-mainstream. Those seem to be similarities. One is invitation only, one accepts open submissions, one serves as a global marketplace, one launches the careers of independent filmmakers. Okay, so we want to basically say, what is the main difference? They take place in different countries, if need be, and that Cannes really focuses on established directors from around the world, whereas Sundance really focuses on independent American cinema, right? Which is exactly what we see in A. Sundance emphasizes independent American cinema, and Cannes focuses on artistic films from established international directors. Perfect. Okay. Right. B, we're focusing on a difference. Is this a difference? No. Okay. C, Cannes is an American film festival. That's not right. Okay, so those are different from each other, but not correct. And then D, again, we want to focus on a difference. We don't see a difference there. So that's how we arrive to A for 26. All right, so question 27 is a rhetorical synthesis question, meaning we really need to focus on the question itself. We want to make the argument that tropical rainforests require more stringent protections against resource extraction due to their ecological value. So we really need to focus on tropical rainforests, okay? And the fact that they need more stringent protections because they have high ecological value. So what do we see here? Biodiversity is higher in tropical rainforests, and tropical rainforests are subject to major resource extraction. So basically those, right? Okay, compared to temperate rainforests, which are protected from major resource extraction, or used to be, at the very least in America. So now, A, we have basically the fact that tropical rainforests face significant threats. That's good. But do we see any connection to their biodiversity? No. Right? Here we say deforestation does not cause lasting damage. Is that true? No. Right? Doesn't make that claim anywhere. C, which is correct. We see that there is higher biodiversity in tropical rainforests, and they're more vulnerable to resource extraction due to economic pressures, meaning they should really be protected, right? They're more vulnerable to being damaged, and they are very biodiverse. So it connects with both facets that we need, which is how we arrive to C. And then D, are they naturally a more lucrative target for resource extraction, and do they have very fertile soils? This stuff is not claimed in the passage, so we cannot roll with it. Okay, so we go to C for this last question from Test 308. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you found these review videos helpful.